And so Francis starts to wonder, all right, I'm not finding happiness in partying in the streets. I can't be a knight. What am I supposed to do? And so here's this young man just wandering, trying to figure out in his life what the purpose of life is supposed to be. And Francis, as he's walking along, he comes upon and he sees a poor knight. And he goes to the knight, and he sees that the knight has fallen, on hard times. And so what does Francis do? Francis exchanges his clothes. He takes the poor knight's clothes, puts it on, and Francis takes his nice clothes and gives it to the knight. So right now you start to see that Francis is starting to realize that happiness and joy is going to start being found in giving of himself to others. And so he starts to have a little bit of that joy and tries to experience what the Lord wants him to do. But the biggest thing in Francis's life is the leper. St. Francis hated lepers. He even has it in his writings that when he would experience the lepers, he would be nauseated. And so lepers at the time of Francis were the outcasts. They had to wear a bell around their neck so that you heard them before you saw or smelled them. But Francis is riding along on his horse, probably daydreaming about what he's supposed to do, and all of a sudden he encounters a leper, the one that he least wants to encounter. And so what does Francis do? Francis gets off his horse and embraces the leper. He embraces the leper. And tradition has it the leper disappears, for the leper was Christ. Francis, from that moment on, decided that his life was going to be devoted, wherever he was called to be, to the poorest of the poor. And he spent most of his life dealing with the lepers. And he would tell his friars that the friars are to work with those people that no one else wants to deal with. That's where you're supposed to be. And so I remember telling my class in Florida, when I first got to Florida, of course, currently there's a history of the friars, but in Florida they had no idea who the friars were. So I was explaining to my freshman religion class that the friars, according to Francis, are to work with people that no one else wants to work with. The poorest of the poor, the losers. And all of a sudden the light went off in their mind and said, wait a minute, Father, you're talking to us. You're dealing with us. And I said, who the heck wants to deal with teenagers this day and age? You are kind of like the lepers in a sense. But one of the things in the writings, it says that Francis got off his horse. And you say, okay, big deal. But riding a horse at the time of Francis was a sign of power. And so Francis, you heard the term, get off your high horse. He had to get off his high horse, in a sense, lower himself so that he'd be able to embrace the leper. And isn't that what the Lord did for us? He humbled himself to become a man. He lowered himself so that he would be among us, the ones who are the lepers, the ones who are the sinners. And so Francis teaches us that, again, if you want to be a follower of the Lord, get off your high horse. Get down with those people that need us the most, those people who cannot repay you. Then Francis went, as he was still in his heart trying to figure out, all right, Lord, where are you leading me? He goes to a broken down church called San Damiano, or St. Damien in English. And he goes and he kneels in front of a cross. And they say from the depths of his heart, what do you want me to do, Lord? Where are you leading me? And so he goes in and prays, and God says in that cross, tradition has it, the cross, the body of Jesus came alive and said, Francis, go rebuild my church that you see is falling into ruins. Go and repair my church, which as you can see is all in ruins. And so what does Francis do? So that's pretty clear. He realizes that the church was physically falling down, but he starts to build a church. He becomes a mason, in a sense, and starts rebuilding the church with bricks and stones and mortar and everything. And people start to follow him. They start to realize, okay, this man is for real. He has found a purpose in his life. And so Francis starts to get followers. And Francis says, I'm going to rebuild the church as best as I can. But then it hit him. The Lord didn't want him to rebuild the church physically. He wanted to rebuild the church in a spiritual way. The church at the time of Francis was full of scandals. We think we have scandals today. We're nothing compared to, for they would laugh at us. There's popes who had kids. There's popes who would name their teenage nephews cardinals. It was bizarre. I'm telling you, the priests lived anything but priestly life. And so Francis saw this. And Francis said, well, I think now I know what I'm supposed to do is rebuild this church that is falling into ruins. Not physically, but certainly spiritually. This San Damiano cross, I'm sure you've seen it around. I don't know if there's any in the classrooms here, but it's a cross that
Have one.
you have one? Yeah. No, I'm just, that's fine. But I'm just saying the cross, it's not particularly a Franciscan cross. It's a cross that was in that church of San Damiano. But it's a cross that tells the story of John's gospel, of the crucifixion. Whereas Jesus' eyes are open, which shows in John's gospel, Jesus is in a sense in charge. He's the one who gives himself to be killed. It's not taken from him. And then there's some pictures, it's not the greatest, but there's some pictures of the Martha and Mary and the other Marys and John underneath the cross. And then up top, there's Jesus ascending into heaven with the apostles. And then on the very top, there's a little hand with two fingers. That's the image of the Father blessing Jesus. But anyway, it was a special cross in the life of the friars. We still have this cross, the same cross that spoke to Francis. It's not in San Damiano anymore. It's in the Basilica of St. Clare. So you can still go and you can see the cross that spoke to Francis. Francis then realizes, again, going back to his father, he and his dad didn't have the greatest relationship, but he said, all right, if I'm going to repair the church, I got to live the gospel life, which means I got to live like Jesus Christ. And he realized that Jesus Christ lived a poor life. And one day Francis went into a little church with his early followers, and he said, we're going to open the Bible, the scriptures, 3 times. I'm going to point whatever I see. And so he opened the Bible the first time, and it talked about giving all you have to the poor and following Jesus. Opened it a second time, it talked about, Jesus saying, don't take a sack with you or traveling bag or sandals. The third one was about going and preaching to the people. And so Francis said, that's it. That's what I have longed for. That's what my heart desires, to live that gospel. And as an aside, that missal is at the Walters Art Gallery here in Baltimore. So I saw it. We had a special viewing. I wasn't able to touch it, but I kind of got a little close to it. But it's on display now at the Walters. But Francis realized he had all these clothes. And so what does he do? He calls his father to the town square. And Francis, with his father on one side, the Bishop of Assisi on another, takes off all his clothes. He strips himself and throws the clothes at his father's feet and says, Father, no longer will call you my father, but I'm going to call God my father. And so I'm no longer you. And so the bishop, with his cope, came over and wrapped Francis, his naked body, symbolic of the church, embracing Francis. We never hear what happens with Francis and his dad. Sometimes you want to make up a nice story that they made up. We don't see anything. There's nothing, and a lot of studies have been done. So again, I think a lot of times when it comes to saints are real people. And, dealings with dads sometimes aren't always the easiest. And so, again, Francis, who is one of the greatest saints, in my opinion, of course, but had a problem with his own father. And so, again, Francis renounces all his worldly goods, gives everything he has away, and follows Jesus as a poor man. The first account of that we have in the church. But Francis did not want anyone to know he had this, because he was afraid that people would take him and make him a saint or misunderstand him. And so he always had it covered. Until on the night of October 3rd, 1226, he was about to die. And he told his friars, "I want to die naked on the ground, just as Jesus died naked on the cross." The friars said, "Yeah, that's nice, but it ain't going to happen. You're not dying naked on our floor." So they said, "What we'll do is we'll take your habit off and put a borrowed habit on, so you won't own your habit, your robes." And when they took it off, they noticed at that time his wounds of his hands, his feet, and his side. It was only then that little brother Leo, who was his companion over here, told the story of what had happened. And so Francis, when you see Francis, he always has the nail marks in his hands, his feet, and his side. And even the coat of arms of the Franciscans are two crossed arms. One arm is bare, which is Jesus' arm. The other arm has the sleeve on it, which is Francis' arm. But both hands have the wounds in their hands. And so Francis teaches us, really, as I said, the crib and the cross are the two hinges in Francis' life, where he was able to reflect on the incarnation, to see how really good God is, but also the cross, in the sense of how God loves us so much that he was willing to die for us. And Francis, in his very body, had the imprints of Christ crucified. Francis also had a great desire to preach, especially among the Muslims. And Francis wanted to go to Syria. We still see Syria in the news today. So Francis, in the year 1212, 6 years after his conversion, he says, "I'm going to go to Syria and preach to the Muslims." And so he gets on a ship, but as he's traveling to Syria to preach the gospel, the ship encounters a storm, and they had to kind of abandon their course and just pull off to the side. And Francis never made it to Syria to preach, but he did have a severe case of malaria. And so again, he keeps getting sicker and sicker and sicker. But what Francis decides, he says, well, if I can't go to Syria, if I can't go to Syria, I'm going to send friars to the Muslims. I'm a little computer goofy. I don't want to show them. Okay. Francis sends 5 friars to the Muslims, to Morocco. And he tells the friars they are to preach the gospel. Well, the friars go to Morocco, and they go through Portugal. And as they're going through Portugal, they encounter an Augustinian named Anthony. And Anthony was impressed. He said, well, what are you guys doing? Because we're going to go and preach to the Muslims. And so Anthony was impressed. The 5 friars go on to Morocco. You know the term "in your face"? The friars were in the face of the Muslims. They go right away and they start to preach the gospel. They don't take into account any of the cultural situations. They go into a mosque and they start to mock the Islam, the religion, because they think this is going to change the Muslims. So anyway, we laugh and say, come on, these guys weren't the smartest ones. But anyway, they were determined, and the leaders didn't want them in the area, so they kept sending them away. Go back to Assisi. Go back to Assisi. And they kept trying to, persuade them. They were torturing the friars. One time they brought the friars into a room and brought all these beautiful women in and said, if you leave, you can have them all. And the friars said, no, we're going to stay. So it got to the point where they were beheaded. So they were the first 5 Franciscan martyrs. Now, Francis says there's got to be a different way. And he writes a chapter in his rule that says the friars who want to go among the Muslims, you can go, but you can live among them first. Live among them first, which means don't do anything, don't get in anyone's face yet. Just live among them. And then, once you live among them, then you can start preaching if you feel that's what God wants you to do. And so the friars are to live among the people with whom they are sent as missionaries. We tried that when we were in Jamaica. As I said, I was a missionary in the mountains of Jamaica. I wasn't on the beach drinking Red Stripe or anything, but if you ever go to Jamaica, they tell you don't leave the compound. Well, we went where they told you not to go. And it was very interesting. We had 4 churches and 7 schools. And 2% are Roman Catholic on the island. And so our schools were more nothing than Catholic. And so our high school had about 800 kids in it. 15 kids were Catholic. Not 15%, 15 kids. And so the Archbishop says you have a lot of work to do up in the mountains. But again, what we did is we went and we lived. We lived, among the people. We didn't, we weren't in their faces. We walked around a lot. We talked to them. And so slowly they were able to understand who we were. But that's what Francis had the desire for the friars to do as missionaries. Now Francis wanted to go meet the Sultan. And so Francis wanted to go, and finally he was able to get well enough to go to the Sultan. And what Francis was kind of countering against were the Crusades. The Crusades that went off and said, kill the Muslims. They are the devil. They are knocking on our door. Kill them, get them out. What does Francis do? Francis says, no, I'm not going to kill. I'm going to go and talk. And so he gets an audience with the Sultan. Interestingly, the Sultan was born the same year as Francis was, so they're the same age. Francis goes in and he talks to the Sultan. And the Sultan is able to listen to Francis because of who he is. Not necessarily by what he says, but who he is. Gentle, kind, he had a great heart. And so he was able to speak to the Sultan about Jesus Christ and peace. And the Sultan realized, hey, not everyone is a crusader trying to kill us. And the Sultan, tradition has it, wanted to convert to become a Christian, but he was afraid of his men. But what he did is he gave Francis clear passage back to Assisi. It's amazing that Francis even made it there. He was safe to go back. And they gave Francis a horn that the Muslims would blow 5 times a day or so as a gift. And we still have that horn in Assisi. This is just a modern picture of Francis embracing the Sultan. What are we experiencing today? I mean, think about it. Muslims and Christians, racial profiling, all those things. And again, it can get complicated in our head. Like I said, the World Trade Center, when that was hit, my dad commuted from our town to the World Trade Center for work. He would take a train up to Newark and then take the PATH train and get out at the World Trade Center and then walk a couple blocks to work. He retired, and the year he retired, his company moved to the World Trade Center. And so when the planes hit him, my dad hadn't retired. He would have been at work already and probably killed. And so my dad, for at least 2 years, was constantly going to funerals because he knew all these people who were killed. But there were, a lot of times there was no bodies. There was, something of the person. And so you get to that experience and you can say, oh, the Muslims are really not, you don't hate them and stuff like that. But I can see how some people can really get caught up in that whole experience. But you need to take a step back and say, wait a minute, that's just a little faction of the Muslim people. And it's not even in the Quran. But Francis realized that, the Muslims aren't the enemy. They aren't the ones to fear. And so Francis went and embraced the Muslim. And so today I think the same thing. One of the things in Ellicott City, where I am, at the shrine on Folly Quarter Road, just down the street we have a huge mosque. And on Fridays it is packed. And one day a couple of the people were coming from the mosque and they drove in front of our building. If you've ever been out there, we're kind of off the road. And they wondered what it was. And they said, we're going to just go drive in and see what's going on up there. So sure enough, they drove up and nothing happened. We didn't shoot them or whatever, because that's what they're afraid of. And we talked to them, and they were so impressed with the shrine and with the friars, and we told them a little bit about Francis and the Sultan, that now they want to do something join us in different activities. And so we're working on bringing the mosque and the shrine together, and which would be an exciting project to do, just so that we can understand them and they can understand us, because really that's what it is. But in the Franciscan life, the Sultan really had an influence on Francis. And the image of the best image of Francis and the Sultan is that they ate a meal together. They ate a meal together. And we know that when we eat meals, we don't just share food, but we share our lives. And so the heavenly kingdom is like that, table fellowship, where we all sit down and share together. And so Francis, by able to share a meal with the Sultan, was able to share life, and the Sultan was able to share his life also with Francis. Francis was probably influenced by, Islam has 99 names for God. And I didn't put all 99 on here, but there's 99, the King of Kings, the Lord of Majesty, the Light, the Guide, the Everlasting, the Patient, all names for God. Francis, when he gets back from the Sultan, he writes praises of God. And in Francis' prayer and praise of God, notice what he does. You are holy, Lord, the only God. You are strong, you are great, you are the Most High. You are love, you are joy and gladness, you are gentleness. Doesn't sound like the 99 names for God. And so Francis was able to Christianize what he experienced from the Sultan, and is able to give praise to the Lord. And so Francis dies October 3rd, 1226, as I said, on the ground. Every year, October 3rd, we have all the Franciscans throughout the world celebrate Transitus, which is a prayer service just recounting what Francis did on his last night. And so Francis wanted the Gospel of John read, where it says that Jesus got up from the table, took off his cloak, and washed the feet of his disciples. And so we read that Gospel from John. Francis wanted bread to be shared, as Jesus did at the Last Supper, and so we share bread. He wanted Psalms to be prayed, that we pray. And so just on Thursday night, we had our Transitus in Ellicott City, where we recall the night that Francis died and went from this life into God. And Francis, in his Canticle of Preachers, calls death a sister, not something to be afraid of, but rather as a gentle sister that takes us from this life to the next. And that's a big influence on the Franciscans, but I think on all of us, that sometimes we're afraid of death. Sometimes we try to do everything we can to escape it. But death for Francis was that sister, that friend, that would take him from this life to the next. And I always wonder, how could Francis do that? What was it about Francis that he was able to call death a sister? I think because Francis encountered little sister deaths throughout his life. And if you think about it, he had to keep dying to himself all the way till October 3rd, 1226. He had to die to that party life. He had to die to his dream about becoming a knight. That wasn't God's dream for him. He had to overcome his disgust and his dislike for lepers. He had to be able to be willing to give of himself, to strip himself for the Lord. His order grows so fast. I think within the first 5 years, there's something like 10,000 friars. And as the friars grew, you start to get different interpretations of what Francis was about to say. There's some friars, within a couple of years that never met Francis. And so Francis was the minister general. He was he was in charge. But then he realized he had to give up the reins. And so he had to turn over being minister general to someone else. And how difficult that must have been for Francis to see the order maybe not necessarily going the way he wanted, but it's the way it was developing. So he had to die to himself there. And so he was able on October 3rd to open up his arms for sister death. And that's the same thing for us. We need to constantly be dying to ourselves so that when that final sister death comes, we're able to embrace and to know that it's going to always lead to new life. Because Francis teaches us that in life, you always need one experience to move on to the next. And I would always tell when I was a guidance counselor at kids, they were always afraid to choose a college. And I would tell them, I said, if you do all your research and you do the best you can, there's really no right and wrong decisions. I would say there's right and left decisions. And so if you choose to go to, Loyola, and that doesn't work out, you really should be a Catholic university. Well, really, in a sense, that you needed that Loyola experience to move on to the next. And then I would have parents would come to me and say, Father, that right-left thing costs money. But anyway, not using the college life for ourselves. Think about experiences that you had. That if you didn't have those experiences, you wouldn't be where you are today. When I was in Florida, the big music down there was country music. I don't know if anybody listens to country music, WPOC now. Growing up in New Jersey, we mocked people who listened to country music. We never listened to country music. When I got to Florida, you couldn't find anything but country music. And the kids would always sing the song with Garth Brooks, Thank God for Unanswered Prayers, where basically it's a song about a guy sitting on the benches in a football field with his wife, and he looks down and he sees his old high school sweetheart. And he says, oh, thank God I didn't marry her. I'm glad I married this one. Unanswered prayers. I would tell Garth Brooks, they're really not unanswered prayers. It was right and left decisions that you're talking about. And if you didn't have the experience with this little one, you wouldn't have your wife today. And so a lot of times we need to reflect and to see what are those decisions that we've made that brought us today. And for Francis, it brought him to sister death. Just as an aside, and this is going to make some sense, Pope Clement XV, there's been about 8 Franciscan popes. None of them are saints. They all had a little bit of shady history. But Clement, even though he did wonderful things for Rome, he really brought about peace and everything. The one thing he's known for is that he suppressed the Jesuit order. Now, my interpretation as a Franciscan is going to be different than the guys down the street at Loyola. Clement was taught by the Jesuits. He had a great admiration for the Jesuits. But the Jesuits were humongous, and they were everywhere, and they were really getting into some political turmoil in the different mission territories. And they were starting to go off a route that really wasn't the best. And then people were jealous within the church of the Jesuits because they were getting the vocations. And so some in the church were starting to spread rumors about the Jesuits. And so there was internal fighting. And so Clement, because he cared so much about the Jesuits, he didn't want to see them go the wrong way, and he wanted to bring peace for the church. He suppressed them. Now, if you ask a Jesuit, they're probably not going to say, thank God you were suppressed. No. But they're not real big with Pope Clement, so just keep that in mind. And so on March 13th, 2013, we have our first Jesuit Pope. Now what name does he take? Francis. And so Francis, again, it was Francis of Assisi. It wasn't any other Francis, and he will say why he chose that. Great images of the Pope. We knew something was up when he takes the bus back to the hotel, and then he pays his hotel bill. And so, right off the bat, the first day, some flags go up saying, this ain't Benedict, and it's some people that are wondering what is going to happen. But my favorite image is Francis sitting in the back of a chapel, getting ready for Mass. This, I think, is his regular chapel where he has Mass in the morning. He just has Mass for the workers. And there's Pope Francis sitting in the last pew, just waiting for something to happen. He has no royal throne. He wears simple clothes. And so he's certainly different than the other popes. And imagine what it must have been like in the Sistine Chapel knowing that the name Francis has so much history to it, that when he says, I will be called Francis, wonder what the other cardinals thought. You know, when you hear Francis, you hear, rebuild my church. And so right away, you think of something with the Pope. Francis said, Pope Francis, when he found out he was being elected, when they were counting the votes, his friend and our Cardinal Archbishop was sitting next to him and said to Francis, don't forget the poor. Don't forget the poor. And he said right then he knew the name he was to take was Francis of Assisi. Because for him, in Pope Francis's own words, he is the man of poverty, he is the man of peace, he is the man who loves and protects creation. That was the first interview Pope Francis gave about why he chose the name Francis. And he was joking that some of his confreres said, well, why don't you take the name Pope Clement the 15th? Because paybacks are, to get back to the Franciscan, then you can suppress the Franciscans. But instead of suppressing the Franciscans, he takes our name. And just the image of the Pope kissing the feet of the prisoners at that youth prison on Holy Thursday. On October 4th, yesterday, 2013, Pope Francis goes to Assisi, where he spent the day. And the first thing he did is he dealt with severely handicapped kids, the poor, and spent the day there. He spent the day visiting the different Franciscan locations. This is the tomb of St. Francis here. This is our Minister General, and Francis went to the tomb. And so Francis goes and prays at the tomb. I don't know if you can see. This little thing here, it's a parchment. And the parchment is the blessing of St. Francis, where Francis says, may the Lord bless you and keep you, may he let his face shine. But he wrote it, and he gave it to Brother Leo. Brother Leo was that little friar in the corner during the stigmata. And Brother Leo, when Francis died, he folded it up and kept it in his pocket, because he always wanted Francis to be close to his heart. When Brother Leo dies, they find this little parchment, they open it up, and it's the writing of Francis of Assisi. And so they put it in a little reliquary, and so they still have that parchment. It's a little hard to read, because if anything is folded for a long time, it loses its clearness. And so the Pope is praying in front of the tomb of Francis and that parchment of Brother Leo's. There was a rumor that among the Italian media that when the Pope would go to Assisi, he was going to start to strip the church of all its riches. You've heard people say that all the time. Why doesn't the Pope sell everything and give to the poor? They said, this guy's going to do it. This is what's going to happen. Well, he goes to the place where Francis stripped himself and threw the clothes at his father's feet. And they said, this is where it's going to happen. The Pope's going to start stripping the church of all its gold and everything else like that. But what does Francis say? This is a good moment to invite the church to strip itself. For the church to strip itself. The church is all of us. And so the focus was not so much on the Vatican giving away all the jewels, but all of us. We are the church. We need to strip ourselves. And he continues to say, well, what must the church strip itself of? It must strip itself today of a greatest of dangers, which threatens every person in the church, all, the danger of worldliness. The Christian cannot live together with the spirit of the world. Worldliness that brings us to vanity, to bullying, to pride, and this is an idol. It is not God, it's an idol. And idolatry is the strongest of sins. And so Francis calls us, he said this yesterday, to strip. To strip of all those things that we have that block us from following Jesus Christ. And so I end with the image of last night, the sun setting in Assisi, with a friar. That's the Basilica of St. Francis. Glorious God, we thank you for the gift of this day. We thank you for the gift of each other. We thank you for the gift of St. Francis. and for the leadership of our Holy Father, Pope Francis. Help us, Lord, through our life, through our words, and most importantly, through our actions, to rebuild the church, but to always to do it within the framework of Holy Mother Church, as you lead us, as you guide us to the kingdom of heaven. And may Almighty God bless us all, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.